So actually, the first thing I wanted to talk about is Paul last week, if you remember, he sent me this picture, which I shared with everybody, that was from a model of the Beit HaMikdash, which was found in Khirbat Kaifa, which, yes, and not far from Michael Schwartz, right? I've never been there, but it's near Beit Shemesh, right? It's in
Oh, is it the
Michael,
Sharaim site that was just
yeah.
excavated recently?
I think I believe so. I believe it's that it's identified with him. Is that there's some look at about that, but actually I can pass this on to other people. What Paul passed on to me. The article was from Makor Rishon from 2015. So I read the article, and then I found another article that article is in Hebrew. I found an article in English, which I didn't read yet, which was one of the academic articles published by the two main archaeologists who did the dig. But then I did one better. I bought their book. The book is in Hebrew. I started to read it. It's really fascinating. I would recommend it for everybody. The beginning of one of the things I can tell you, I like the book already. The beginning of the book is an introduction to it's like archaeology for dummies. It's like it really lays out a lot of very basic things that you need to know about the history of archaeology in Israel and how archaeology in Israel, so that you understand what they were at the site. It also starts to lay out the groundwork for this vikuach, right? This controversy between them and other archaeologists. So there's a school of archaeology.
It's a book by Finkelstein.
By לא פינקלשטיין, גרפינקל, אם אני זוכר. גרפינקל, ורגע, אני אגיד לך את השם, אפילו. אני הורדתי את זה. I bought it and I downloaded it onto my phone as an ebook. Although I think there's an advantage, I'm thinking it's worth having the actual book because they have charts and things which don't show up well on a little screen like this. Although I can also read it on my computer. Hold on a second.
Because Finkelstein doesn't believe in the Mamlacha Meuchedet. I think he has got this.
Finkelstein. It's not Finkelstein. Oh, wait. Did I keep it up here? Oh, yeah, it's actually on my screen. It's called Akavot. David Hamelech Be'emek Ha'ela, Yosef Garfinkel.
Garfinkel, okay.
Sar Ganur, Michael Hazel. It's quite a fascinating book, right? So that's what Paul is saying is, and they lay this out in the book, that like roughly 150 years or so since like serious archaeology has been in Israel, they explain that up until 1980, there was a general tendency by archaeologists to try to match up what they found with Tanakh. But then around 1980, there was a shift. And actually, I was talking to a friend of mine, Morad Derech. She told me it really started earlier than that in the 60s, but I guess it became more prominent in Israel by the 80s. And there's this school they called the Minimalist School. And the Minimalists said, actually, we can ignore Mikra, like we can ignore Tanakh, because that was all written later, and it was not, it's not a reliable source, it's not a historical source. And if we go after what we found actually in archaeology, then the earliest that we can date the Melucha of whatever kingdom or kingdoms were in Israel, the earliest you can go is the 9th century BCE. And that's at least 2 centuries before David and Shlomo would have lived. And so they said, like, David and Shlomo, they're mythical characters. They never existed. And so Garfinkel in the book, he says the approach of the minimalists, he says, imagine that we knew nothing about the Roman Empire, but we knew that in the 17th century, this guy Shakespeare wrote a play about the assassination of Julius Caesar. So the minimalists would conclude that the Roman Empire began in the 17th century, and that Julius Caesar was a mythical character. He says that's basically the logic. So obviously, they disagree. They have strong reason to disagree, and one of the reasons is they were able to make. He expands on this in the book later. He just gives like a little bit of a hint. They established the dates of the site based on burnt olive seeds, which they carbon dated. And apparently, he goes into a little bit of detail about this, about carbon dating, about the pluses and minuses, how it cannot be sometimes. He said, so he explained there's a difference between finding a burnt piece of wood and a burnt seed, because the wood itself could have been hundreds of years old when it was burnt. And that throws off the carbon dating. But seeds, we know that they were from like that year, or maybe, within a year or two. So that's a very significant find. I know they found a lot of other things there as well. And also that this was a major, it was a major settlement. It wasn't just like a little kfar. It was a major settlement. It had a lot of other information. But for the purposes of our discussion, what Paul said was the most relevant point, which is that they found this little model Beit HaMikdash, which was very distinctive for a couple of reasons that I recall. One of them is that it was made out of stone. And that they explained that they have found miniature Batei Mikdash in other digs, but they're always much smaller and they're always made of clay. And this one was larger. It's not huge. He said, I think it's about 20 centimeters by 35 centimeters, something like that. So it's about this big, and apparently was used to store Divrei Kodesh. It was like some kind of a fashion. But as we saw in the picture, there's certain details in this carving which help to explain some of the very difficult psukim that we saw in Malachim and in Divrei Hayamim, where it's describing the architecture, and it's really impossible to say exactly what the psukim are saying. So when you learn them in greater depth, you'll see that different Meforshim explain them in different ways. But the picture saw, which would have been the entrance into the Heichal, I believe, you saw that they had this gated entrance where you had like three, it was like in threes, right? You had like an outer door frame and then a second door frame and a third door frame. And that corresponds to the pasuk that we saw, where it says that it was, I don't know, I think it says like Elo Shalish or Shalosh or something like that. And but I'm not gonna go through all of it right now. But that was a very, very significant finding, and also some other aspects of the carving seem to indicate the way the actual Beit HaMikdash would have been constructed. And so it's for our purposes, people who just want to learn and understand sources, this was a tremendous, tremendous find. And in terms of this controversy about whether or not there was a Malchut David, really, so aside from their find, there had already been a couple of other finds that indicated that there was really a Beit David. There was a stone that was found at Tel Dan that talks Beit David, which apparently the minimalists also, like they also say that's not necessarily what it says, and it's not David, maybe it's Dod, and lo yodea. But there's really a lot of evidence from Churbat Kaifa to indicate the existence of Malchut David B'Shlomo. Now, I'll just say on a personal level, for people of faith, this is a discussion Michael Werner got into with us at Friday night dinner a few weeks ago. In a sense, for a person of faith, it's a lo malev lo morid, which it doesn't matter, right? Because we assume Tanakh to be a reliable source on the one hand, but the other thing I want to say about that is important to remember the way Chazal understood Nach, and Nach is not viewed in the eyes of Chazal primarily as an historical document or as a history. That's not its major purpose. One of the indications of that comes from the Mikra itself, where when you learn, let's say, Sefer Melachim, when you come to the end of a particular king's life, it will say, like, and the rest of his history is down al Sefer Divrei Hayamim L'Malchei Yisrael. In other words, things that kings were concerned about being written in their chronicles. So there was a chronicle that was written down, and that's not the Mikra. The Mikra, the history, the stories that it's bringing are to teach us things. And one of the other indications of that is where Chazal say that Latid Lavo, that Nach will be batel, except for Esther. Esther will be the only sefer of Nach that will not be voided in the final Geula. And there are different discussions about that, but the basic ideas is that Nach, even things that you might not think directly are about this, but Nach mainly Musar. We see it mainly as moral teaching. It's the basis for our society, the way we think of ourselves. So the historical aspects of it, of course, those are important, but we take that part for granted in the sense that what's more important to us are the particular stories chosen to be told, or the particular nivuot, or the particular poems. Those are the things that are important to us, right? So Chazal, I'm speaking here largely, right? But let's say post Second Temple period, when Chazal finalized which Sfarim were going to be included in Tanakh, the criteria that they used to weigh what went in and what didn't go in, it's not always completely obvious to us exactly why certain things were chosen and certain things were not. We have a little bit of a glimpse in because of particular passages from the Gemara or from the Mishnah, from the Tosafta. We know that there were vikuchim about Sefer Shir Shirim, about Esther, about Yechezkel, about Kohelet, all of those things were not obvious, but we also know don't get discussed at all, like Sefer Chachmat Shlomo, which some of the Rishonim have, we have also now, and of course we know there's Apocrypha, Sefer HaMakkabim. There's certain things that don't get discussed at all. So there isn't a discussion, for example, about Sefer Maccabim or Sefer Chashmonaim, whether it should be in or not. Anything that wasn't included, the Gemara doesn't talk about. It's only the ones that got included that the Gemara tells us that there was some kind of vikuach, which was ultimately decided in favor of keeping the book in. So it's a bit of a digression on the whole thing, but all of this to say, the criteria for deciding what's in Tanakh was not based on whether or not Chazal thought a particular book was the most accurate historical reflection of a given period of time. That wasn't, I don't think that was even in the top 5 or 10 things that they were concerned about. They were concerned about the inherent truth of particular books, if I may say so. So anyway, I do find the discussion is interesting, and in a way of course it's all very exciting when we find things that confirm what are in Tanakh, but I would also caution that it's not, I don't think it's a good basis for faith, right? In other words, I don't think one should base their faith on archaeological evidence. I think maybe it helps to bolster faith. Lo yodea. To me, I just find it very interesting, and on top of it, it may help us to understand the Mikra better, and that's truly fascinating. Anyway, that's what I have to say about that. But if anybody else wants to say anything about it, you can pipe in before we start the shiur proper. So, okay, let's begin. Right, so today, excuse me, I want to go back to this parak in Divrei HaYamim. One of the issues that we still have left outstanding has to do with menorah and how the menorah was situated in the Beit HaMikdash, whether it went from east to west or whether it went from north to south, and also the avodah of the menorah, also, both in the morning and in the evening. And along with that, we need to up some details about the avodah that went in the evening at the end of the day, because we went through all Masechet Tamid, and it really describes from the earliest part of the day until the end of bringing the Tamid Shel Shachar. But it doesn't it doesn't describe to us the Tamid Ben Ha'arbayim, and it doesn't describe to us how that avodah went. We ended up on some of that in Yoma. If you remember, I sent you those charts on the spreadsheet, because we were trying to figure out the order of the day on Yom Kippurim and so forth. And so we included at what point different korbanot were done, also later in the day, including the korban tamid shel ben harbayim. But even then, I didn't include all of the things like hatavat hamerot ben harbayim, or the chavitin kohen gadol ben harbayim. There are certain things we just didn't touch on. So I'm going to try to squeeze this in the next, I'm not sure how many shiurim, hopefully just 2 or 3 shiurim. But to start off with, I think it behooves us to go back and look at Divrei Hayamim, because we mentioned, and I just want to reiterate that in addition to the kruvim, which were these huge kruvim that Shlomo put into his temple, he also added other kelim, right? He added menorot and he added shulchanot. So I want to just go over that now, and then we're going to start to do a in Masechet Menachot that discusses the placement of the kelim in the Beit HaMikdash. So this is Divrei Hayamim Bet Perek Dal. Right before this, where it mentions the we went through just a lot of what we saw in Perek Gimel had to do with the Kodesh HaKodeshim, right? We went through that, and here maybe we'll just look at this quickly. Vayas Sifnei Habayit Amudim Shnayim Amod 35 Orech V'Hatzefet Asher Al Rosho Amod 5. So he made in front of the house, in front of the Beit HaMikdash, 2 columns that were 35 amot high, where the tzefet that was on top of them was 5 amot. Tzefet is, here they translate it as the plated capital of pillar. It was like, it's a little topping to the pillar. And those, right, so those amudim are also described elsewhere. They were specially made. They were made of bronze, as I recall. They were made in Bikat HaYarden, where they dug out, they had to dig out holes in the ground in order to cast them. And I don't know enough about that. That's also a bit of a digression. But one time I did have an expert explain to me how they were done. A person who's an expert in metallurgy and an ancient material. And he explained to me exactly how they would have been made. So anyway, Vayas Shashurot B'Dvir, Vayiten Al Rosh Amudim, so there are these other chains and so forth, these decorations. So they put up the amudim on the front, one on the right, one on the left. Right? So this is Yachin and Boaz. It's also described in Sefer Melachim. Okay, now we come to Perek Dal. Vayas Mizbach Nechoshet 20 Amah Orko v'Yesrim Amah Rachbo v'Eser Amot Komato. So this Mizbeach of copper, it was covered in copper. It was 20 amot by 20 amot by 10 amot. Now, at some point, we may learn Masechet Midot, and I think actually a long time ago, I think I did a Mishnah that describes the Mizbeach in Bayit Sheni, and the dimensions seem to be different. There's the sugya that we're going to look at in Masechet Menachot. I'm going to skip that, the part that this is the dimensions for the Mizbeach, but maybe eventually we'll come back to it. Yes?
This is the Mizbeach outside, I understand, the one
right.
Which is in front of the temple.
Right. That's the Mizbeach HaNechoshet, which is also described in the Chumash. Here then we Yas et Hayam Mutzak Eser b'ama misvato el svato agol saviv mesh b'ama komato v'kav shoshim b'ama yasov oto saviv. Okay, so he made the yam, he makes artificial pool, mutzak, that was cast. It was 10 amot from one tip to the other tip. It was round, right? Agol saviv. It was round all the way around. It was 5 amot high. The kav shoshim ba'ama. Kav here would it's the line. The line, the circumference was 30 amot that went around it. Now, here also, actually, I hadn't planned to show you this, but hold on a second. Since we're here, oops. Okay, so since we know, because we know the area of we know the value of pi, or at least we know the concept of pi. I guess nobody knows the value of pi per se because it's an irrational number. But
the Babylonians and the Egyptians knew it better. They already knew it was something like 3.14, but maybe the Hebrews didn't know it very well.
Well, so yeah, I want to show you something, right? So why do you say that? Because here we just saw a pasuk that says that the diameter of this pool was 10, and its circumference was round, and it was 30. Now, of course, that could have been literally true, and it would have been an ellipse. Just it would be a little bit off of a real circle. It would have been an ellipse. In other words, if you take, but of course, we measure an ellipse by diameter, right? Because you need to get the proper dimensions for the ellipse. It's not enough just to know diameter. You would need, right? So because there's more than one actual. They don't call it a diameter, but you need 2 points plus, plus the other circumference. So I want to show you something interesting. Just I think I skipped it. Hold on a second. Okay, so here, this is the peruk in Malachim Aleph. Vayaset hayam mutzak 10 ba'ama misfato ad sfato aksaviv, v'chamesh ba'ama komato, v'kav 30 ba'ama yasov oto. So it's almost word for word what we saw in Divrei Yamim, but there's an interesting thing here. There's a Korean active. So the Kri is the Kav. That's in the skits, the Kav, and the Ktiv, the way it's written is the Kava. So the Kava, the Hey would just be possessive, like indicative would be possessive in line, its circumference. So somebody noticed this, and I'll show you. This is quite fascinating. If you take if you take the gematria of kav and kava, let's drop the first vav because that's not relevant. So you have 106 and 111. So if you take the 111 and divide it by the 106, this odd number, 1.047, etc. If you multiply that by the 30, or let's say by 3, you get 3.115. So somebody, I don't remember where I first heard it, and then somebody said it was mentioned in Monk. I don't remember. I'm not going to try to give you the source. Somebody noticed this, and this is like the fudge factor, right? This is what the fudge factor that was played. You can make of that what you will, but it is interesting that the fudge, that it works as a fudge factor up to 3 places. But I'm also not sure what it's supposed to mean. In other words, are we supposed to understand from that the actual size? I just want to know pshat. So does it mean that the circumference wasn't really 30? It was really 31.41. Is that what it's supposed to mean? Or the other way? Am I to now take away from the, lo yodeas? I'm not sure what it describes to us, but it's just one of these interesting things. The other thing that's interesting about it from a textual point of view, there's no real textual difference in terms of meaning between saying kav and kava. The hey here would be mudgeshet, right? Or it's like, because it would be a possessive hey. So it doesn't really change the meaning of the pasuk if you say kav or kava. But it does give us this little bit of an insight. Anyway, I wasn't planning to do that in any great detail, but since we were learning it, I just thought I'd point that out. It's one of these little interesting things. Okay, describes the Yam Shel Shlomo. All right, so this is what's known as the Yam Shel Shlomo. So this is one of the things that Shlomo's in that we didn't have in the Mishkan. It wasn't a yam in the area of the Beit HaMikdash. We have a kiyor. We don't have like this big pool, right? So this is, and it's quite impressive, right? It's 30 amot, it's 5 high, it's 30 amot in difference, 10 amot in diameter, amot high. So it's holding a lot of water. I didn't do the cheshbon, but you could figure out how much water it's holding. It's holding quite a lot of water. And Dumut Bekarim Tachad Lo Saviv Saviv Soto. There are these images of cattle underneath, around. Esther Ba'amam Akifim Et Hayam Saviv. The 10 amot, they're surrounding the yam, the pool. Shnaim Turim Abakar Yitzukim B'Mitzukato. There are 2 rows of bakar that are cast in their casting. Made al Shnei Masar, and it's standing on. In other words, the yam is resting on these cast cattle. These cattle that were cast out of metal. Shosha ponim tzafona u'shosha ponim yam. There's 12 of them. 3 are facing north, 3 are facing west. Shosha ponim negba. 3 are facing south. Shosha ponim mizracha. 3 are facing east. V'hayam alehem milamala. The yam is on top of them. V'kol achorehem baita. And their behinds are facing inside. In other words, baita here apparently underneath the yam. Baita would be inside, toward the inside, this area. It was the thickness of it was 1 tefach, presumably the thickness of the yam itself, including its walls, and its safa, right, the lip that we described before, kamasei sfat kos perach shoshana. It was made like the lip of a cup, like like a lily flower, right? Machazik batim shoshet alefim yachil. It would held 3,000. Let's say 3,000 baths. It held a lot of water. Bayas kiorim asara. Right. So the Torah doesn't say anything about making a yam, and Shlomo makes a yam. And then Torah says to make one kiyur, and Vayas kiorim asara. He makes 10 kiyurim. Vayitem miyamin, chamisha mismol, l'rachza bahem, et maseh ha'ola yadichu bam, v'hayam l'rachza l'kohanim bo. So he makes 10 kiyurim. Excuse me. He places 5 on the right, 5 on the left, to wash with them. The doing of the olah would be rinsed on them, and the yam that we just described, this artificial pond, the rachza lekohanim bo. That was for the kohanim to wash in. So
that is strange, because they used it for purification, but I thought purification you should do in the mikveh, and not in this bath.
right.
How to call it.
So the question, there are a few questions in this pasuk itself. One of them is just in terms of placement. It says he made 10 kiorim, and he put 5 on the right and 5 on the left. So 5 on the right of what, and 5 on the left of what? In relative to what were they to the right and the left? So
of the yam, maybe the water of the yam filled up the kiorim. You can't understand it from here.
Right. In other words, that might be true, and it might be something else. We'll come back to this. I want to go to the next few psukim. And then also what Paul said, right? First of all, we understood from the idea of the kiyor from the Torah, that's where the Kohanim, and we also saw this in the Mishnah. Kohanim would go to wash their hands and legs. They would take water to wash their hands and legs. And here it says, so they were made to wash with them. If you're familiar with Tamei Mikra, this is the way the pasuk gets broken up. Vayas kiurim asara, that's one stitch. Vayitain chamisham yamin v'chamisham l'rachza bahem. That's the next stitch. He put 5 to the right and 5 to the left to wash with them. Et maseh ha'olah yadichu bam. The doing of the olah was rinsed off with them. So does that mean that's in addition to the washing that Kohanim would do, or is that describing the rechitza, that there wasn't? But see, there's a difference in terms. Here it says the rachza bahem, and then it says yadichu bam, right? So what's the difference between rechitza and hadacha? So hadacha would, in English, you'd say like to rinse off, right? Whereas the rachza would be to wash. And we think of those as different pulot. But what is this stitch describing? Now, remember when we learned Masechet when they had to rinse out the innards, that in the north, the Azara, there were tables that were set out where they would use them for, among other things, for washing out the insides of the animals that were being slaughtered. And here it says, Maseha Ola Yadichu Bam, using these kiorim. Kiorim are in the north, they're in the south part of the Azara. They're near the Mizbeach. So that's also not exactly clear. Then, Vayam Narachza the Kohanim Bo. Right? So it sounds like the Yam was used for the Kohanim wash in. So what does that mean? Does that mean it's used like a mikvah? Was it a mikvah? If it was a proper mikvah, the way we understand the mikvah to be, it would have had to have been from rainwater. They would have had to have gathered rainwater, had to let it rain until it filled up, or they would have to make some other kind of mechanism to gather rain. Is that really what it means? And as you remember, we went through these Masechet Tamim and we went Masechet Yoma. We didn't see there isn't a yam that's in Bayit Sheni, and we talked about two mikvaot. There was a mikvah, actually three. We altogether we discussed three different mikvaot. There was a mikvah at the Leviim, the Kohanim who were in Beit HaMoked. That was, if you remember back to the very beginning of Asmid, Beit HaMoked, which is on the north side of the Beit HaMikdash. So there are Kohanim that are sleeping there, and if one of them is Ro'eh Keri, right, he has a nocturnal emission, and then he goes down and underneath the temple proper, underneath the Temple Mount, there's a mikvah, and he goes to the mikvah and he comes back up. And that's one mikvah. We had a mikvah near Shar Hamayim, which was on the south side into the Beit HaMikdash, into the Azara, and the Kohen Gadol would tavel there his first tevilah, right? Because he can't do the Azara before he does it. And then afterwards, his others are on a mikveh that's on Beit HaParva, which is not far from there in the south, like the southeastern corner. So we have these three mikvaot, but none of them are the Yam Shel Shlomo. So this Yam, it's an addition. It's not mentioned anywhere in the Torah. And the Kiorim, the 10 Kiorim, so Torah only mentions one. So to understand this to be an extra 9, or these 10 Kiorim in addition to the one that would have already been from Mimei Moshe. Then we have a similar question here. Vayas et menorot hazahav eser k'mishpatam. 10 menorot of gold, as is their mishpat, right? As is their law. Vayitain b'heichal. He placed them in the heichal. Chamesh miyamin v'chamesh mismol. 5 on the right and 5 on the left. On the relative to what? On the right of what? On the left of what? And are these 10 menorot in addition to the menorah of Moshe? Or is this 9 more for a total of 10? Similar questions here about the road. And then we come to Pasuk Chet. Vayas shulchanot asara. Made 10 shulchanot. Vayam behechal. He placed them also in the hechal. Chamisha miyamin v'chamisha mismol. Vayas mizrakei zahav me'ah. He also, again, he made 10, 5 to the right, 5 to the 5 right of what? To the left of what? We don't know. It doesn't say. Are these 10 shulchanot in addition to the shulchan the Torah tells us? Or is it that one plus 9? And he made Mizrukei Zahav, he made 100 Mizrukei Zahav. The Mizrak, is a kli for capturing blood. And he made, so that's in addition, right? He made 100 Mizrukei Zahav. Yas Chatzar Kohanim Va'azara Gdola. He made the courtyard of the Kohanim and the Azara Hagdola, the large Azara. So that the Azara Hagdola is in addition to the Chatzar HaKohanim. There's a Chatzar Kohanim, and there's an Azara Gdola. Udulatot la'Azara, the Daltotehem HaNechosher. So the doors to the Azara and the door and their doors, he covered with copper. V'tayam. V'atayam natan miketef hayemanit kedma mimul negba. This yam that we mentioned before, he places it miketef hayemanit kedma from the right shoulder eastward, mimul negba, across from the south. Right? So what does that mean? Like what exactly, right? And he set the sea on the right side, eastward toward the south. So here, the Mitargem here, I don't know who did the Tirgum. On the right side of the house, eastward toward the south. But that doesn't actually make it that much clearer exactly where this was. And of course, one of the questions is, whenever we're talking about right and left, it's not just right and left in regards to, well, it's always, I should say it this way. Is there an absolute left in the Beit HaMikdash, or is it only relative to something that I'm facing? But since I can also face things from different angles, how helpful is it for me to know that something's on the right or the left, unless I know. I need more information, in other words, for left to become indicative of what the intention is. I don't know what the right here is. We mentioned in an earlier shiur, when we were talking about the Kodesh HaKodashim and the building right next to, we talked about the compartments that are built around the Beit HaMikdash on 3 sides, that there, to the right of the Beit HaMikdash meant to the south. The idea then being that somebody that we ended up like with the Kohen Gadol in Kodesh HaKodashim on Yom Kippur, his back would have been to the western side and his face would be toward the east. So his right would be the south. His left would be the north. Is that also what it means here? Is the right here always the south? Or is it just right and left relative to something that we're facing, maybe from a different direction? Again, not clear.
So my understanding, I don't know if this applies to these texts specifically, but my understanding is that at least sort of in the ancient Mediterranean world, the default would be facing east. So we assume that something facing east, and so your right would be south and left would be north. I mean, that's where we get our term orient from, to orient oneself. To find, it's like finding true. It's like finding true north. You would find true east.
Actually, I have a slightly different history for how we got to Orient, but
it could be. This is what I remember. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, I understand, and I'm not. It's interesting what you're saying. If it's relevant here or not, I just don't know. I don't know. We're going to have to go through and see some of the Perushim here. Just a second. Let's read a little further. ויעש חורם את הסירות ואת היעים ואת המזרקות, ויכל חורם לעשות את המלאכה אשר עשה למלך שלמה בבית האלוקים. So Huram, who's also known as Hiram, he was the king of Tsor, of Tyre. And that's where Shlomo went to get, he was his supplier for materials and also for some of the, for a large part of the skilled workforce. So it describes these other things that were made. In other words, these are kelim that are being made for the Beit HaMikdash. There are sirot, they're like pots, and ya'im, which, you know, in modern Hebrew, ya'eh is like a dustpan, right? But it's some kind of pan that is also going to be used for in the Mikdash Mizrach. It's a kli that is going to be used for blood, and then throwing the blood with that, like from the word Yisrok. Vayechal Huram, to the Ktiv is Chiram. But here in Divrei Yamim is called Huram. Lasot et hamlacha, he finished this work, asher Samamer Sheta Elokim. Amudim Shnayim, V'agulot V'rot Arosh Amudim Shtayim, V'asfachot Shtayim, V'chasot et Shtei Gulot HaKotorot asher al Rosh Amudim. So these are the two columns mentioned before, and they have gulot, some kind of ball or something that's on top of them. There's whatever, I'm not going to get into, but there's different kinds of decoration. There's these pomegranates, 400 to the tune, net, what's the word? Can't think of the word. Lattice work, network, that's a lattice work, right? There are these lattices that are on these amudim, שניים טורים לסבכה, אחד לכסות את שתי גולות הכתורה, אשר בני עמודים, right? So there was like lattice work that was covered with rimonim that went around these gulot, these balls. I assume that that's what that means. Yeah, basin or bowl. ואת המכונות עשה ואת הכיורות עשה על המכונות. So the mechonot are the stands, right? The foundations for that are holding up the kiorot. He made these for the kiorot. Et hayam echad, et habakar shnei masar tachtav. He made the one yam and the 12 bakar. These are all things that Huram made. ואת הסירות ואת היעים ואת המזרקות וכל כליהם אשר עשה חורם אביו למלך אביו, that Huram, his father, the father of his father was also, I think his father was also Huram. He made all of these for King Shlomo, for Beit Hashem, the Maruk. Maruk meaning scoured, like, right? The broke, polished copper. And here
Sure.
just yes, go ahead.
Wouldn't it make sense to check how the Phoenicians built their temple to understand something? Because if they were the people who built the temple, you speak here about the Melech Tzor, but there were also this Givlim from Byblos, who also were associated with the building of the temple. So it would make sense to check how Phoenicians built their temples.
Yes, you know, if you want, wait, maybe we get greater insights of materials and how they're made. Here it has this little discussion about the amudim, the becoming Yitzhakam HaMelech, right? The king cast on the area of the Kikar, the plain next to the Yarden, Abiha Adama, in the thickness of the ground. In other words, they dug into the ground to do the casting. These are huge, right? These are huge, huge columns. And like I say, this, I'm pretty sure we could find, like, do a little bit of research. Like I said, this fellow explained it to people, know how this was done, right? But since you wouldn't, in order to cast such large things, the easiest would be to cast it into the ground rather than build something to hold the cast. They would dig a hole into the ground and put whatever is going to capture the molten copper, the molten bronze. They would capture it in the ground. And they even say where it was, Bein Sukkot and Bein Tzreidatan. There was this place between Sukkot and Tzreidatan. That's where they did this casting. And I think it's also significant that it was done there near the Yarden, because I think you also need you'll need water. You need an easy access to supply of water when you're doing this kind of casting. I'm not enough of an expert to not expound on that. I'm not an expert at all, I should say. Shlomo made all of these kelim, great multitude. They didn't even check to see how much nechoshet was used, right? So the three metals that are used for making kelim, you have gold and silver and nechoshet, copper. They didn't. Right, so copper is obviously the cheapest, and there was so much they didn't even keep count. So he makes these kelim, right, for Beit Elokim, the golden mizbeach. So that's the one that's inside the heichal. Ve'et hashulchanot, right? Even though the Torah only says to make one, made shulchanot, he made tables. Ve'aleihem lechem hapanim, and he put lechem hapanim on them. So he made these 10 shulchanot, and each one of them had lechem. It's a lot of lechem, right? Because the Torah describes the shulchan. It had 12 lechamim. 12 loaves of bread. So we have at least 10 times that much. It's a lot of bread. And he made the menorot and their lamps to burn them kamishpat, the way they should be. The din is, the way the law is, in lifnei hadvir, in front of the dvir, in front of the wall that separates the heichal from the Kodesh HaKodashim, with closed gold. So what's closed gold? So could mean that it's like the Torah describes, that it has to be made single piece of gold, but that wasn't cast gold, right? The Torah says is this idea that has to be beaten gold. But so I'm just going to point out in these two psukim about the shulchanot and the menorot, it sounds like substitutes a bunch more shulchanot and a bunch more menorot, but he treats them the same way as he would treat a single shulchan and a single menorah. In other words, it's like all of the menorot were in the same way that the single menorah was lit in the Mishkan. And it sounds like, just like the lechem hapanim was put on the shulchan in the Mishkan, so that it sounds like there's going to be lechem hapanim on all of these shulchan. Right? So it's a great expansion of those two things. V'perech v'nerot v'melkahav u'michlot zahav. Right, so these are the kelim that were used for the nerot, v'mizamrot, v'mizrakot, v'kapot, v'machtot zahav sagur, u'petach habayit דלתותיו הפנימיות לקודש הקודשים ודלתי להיכל זהב. Right, so this was the other pasuk that I was looking for last time, where it describes these are also kelim, the mizamrot, the mizrakot, kapot, machtot, and it says the opening of the house, its inner doors were to the kodesh hakodeshim, and the doors of the house, lahechal, to the house of the Hechal, all of those doors were of zahav. So it sounds like there's doors that go inside, open inside into the Kodesh HaKodeshim, and daltei habayit lahe and then there's doors that are opening into the Hechal. We'll come back to that.
Shell,
Yes.
it occurs to me, because I'm not sure, might this be a critique against Shlomo, who exaggerated and enslaved the people during 14 years to build the temple? It took him 7 years to build the temple and 14 to build his own Armon. And maybe the people who wrote the Tanakh didn't like that.
Why would you, where do you see that it's being critical though?
Because there is a huge exaggeration with all these tables and menorot and zahav and so.
I could say that maybe
but people were enslaved for all this period to work on the temple. Maybe it wasn't needed.
There is the conversation between, was it, I get the two kings, was it Rehoboam and the people, and the after Shlomo's death. They say, why don't you lift the mosque, why don't you lift these tributes? And they say, no, I'm going to pour it on. So that would seem to, that is not, it would suggest that at least on the side of the people, if not the text itself, there was some discontent.
No, that's for sure. But in fact, what I was going to say is the discontent of the people is not made known in Mikra until after Shlomo dies. Because we find it out after Shlomo dies, and the people complain to Rehoboam. But we don't see in Shlomo's own time that there's a complaint. But Paul is saying, what Paul is saying is not necessarily refuted by that point. It's just I don't see it here, and what I see here is it's kind of a laundry list of all the things that Shlomo made. It's trying to keep count of things that Shlomo made, and I could see this in the context of something that's being revered, that's being praised. I don't see here anything that the idea that this is like that it's mugzam, there was much more than was needed. I don't see an indication here in the Mikra right here that it's saying that it's in any way crying what Shlomo did because it was too much. And what you say is true. Actually, there's a discussion earlier in Divrei Yamim, at the end of Divrei Yamim, going back to David, where it already talks about the workforce. There were different workforces. Not all of them were slaves. Not everybody who built the temple was a slave. And also, we have to also be careful with this notion of slave, because we're not talking about the same kind of chattel slavery that they had in the South in the United States, but still, it's not something desirous. what the people say to Shlomo, to Rechavam after Shlomo, there was a mas, and the mas is that's the mas. The mas is that you need to go to work for the king for a period of time, like being drafted into the army. Anyway, yes, there was a lot of discontent about that elsewhere, but I don't see any. I just don't see it here in this mikra. I don't see it. For our purposes,
We also might note the people are generally not shy about complaining.
yeah, and also here's the thing: when you go back and you compare the account that's in Malachim Aleph and here in Divrei Yamim Bet, there's virtually no difference in these particulars. There's virtually no difference, and somebody could have, in one or the other versions, somebody could have said more. For our purposes, what I'm concerned about or what I want to know, we're not necessarily going a lot of time to figure out all of these things, but I wanted to make sure you're aware that there are all of these things in Bayit Shel Shlomo. Yam, which is standing on top of 12 steers, and in addition, we have 10 kiorot outside next to the Mizbeach. And then inside the Heichal, we have 10 shulchanot and we have 10 menorot. Now, he doesn't make another Mizbeach Zahav. There aren't 10 Mizbachot Zahav. There aren't 10 Mizbachot, there aren't, I'm sorry, there aren't 10 Mizbachot Nechoshet. He doesn't, there's only certain kelim that he makes more of, the kior, the shulchan, and the menorah. And obviously he doesn't make another aron, one aron. So why were these particular things expanded? Where exactly were they standing? It says, right, miyamin umo. And we still are left with these questions about how many kiorim and menorot and shulchanot were there. Was there 1 plus 10, or was it 10 including the one that came from the Mishkan? I think, you know what? If everyone doesn't mind, I think stop here. Next, we're going to look a little bit closer at some of these things, but I'll tell you now, and I'll try to send you sheets in advance. We're going to be looking at the Gemara Masechet Menachot on Daf Tzadichet Amud. Some time ago, I think I showed you Mishnah in Perek Yud Aleph in Menach. And those of you who also want to compare this, still after Menachot, it starts off by talking about the Shtei HaLechem and how they were made, and then talks about the Lechem Apanim and how they were made, the Chavitei Kohen Gadol, how they were made, and then it goes into greater detail about the shape of the Lechem Apanim and the Shtehem. I know that we talked about that somewhat. And then beginning in Mishnah Hey, and I think we went through this Mishnah, it talks about the Shulchan, the dimensions of the Shulchan, and how the Lechem sat on the Shulchan. There's a Machloket and Rabbi Yehuda. And then some detail to describe the Shulchan. And it has this line at the end of Mishnah Vav that says, Kol hakelim shehanikdash orkan orko shel bayit. All of the vessels were in the Beit Mikdash, their length went the length of the house. So the length of the house, meaning the length of the Beit Mikdash, went from east to west. That's the long side is from east to west, right? It's 60 amot from the western wall to the eastern wall within the Beit Mikdash. And from side to side, it's 20 amot. So that's the width. So the kelim that were in the Mikdash, their length went the length of the house. And that would imply then that the Khan would have gone from east to west. It would imply that the menorah went from east to west. It would also imply that the Aron went from east to west. But we know that the Aron doesn't. So Kol HaKelim doesn't include everything. We know from elsewhere, and you'll see in the Gemara, we learned that psukim that we already learned in Divrei Yamim, that the Shulchan went from north to south.
Would the Aron be considered a Kli?
Yes, all of these are kelim. Also, the Mizbeach HaZahav is a Kli, but it doesn't matter whether it went from north to south or east to west because it was square, right? So you could say whichever way you want. It's square. The Shulchan and the Menorah had a long side, and they had a length and a width that were different. So the sugya, I'm going to skip for now the sugya that begins right after this Mishnah. It gets in the first couple of dapim get into quite a lot of detail about the shulchan, about how the bread was placed on the shulchan, and certain other measurements. This is also the sugya that's about measurements of the mizbeach, and so I mentioned at the beginning of the shir that the mizbeach, as it's described in Divrei Yamim, is 20 by 20, but there's a discussion about that there. But what we want to do is we're going to skip ahead to the part of the sugya that talks about this issue of which direction were the kelim. So yes, kelim. It's a much more inclusive term. When we say a kli vessel, it's a limited understanding because kelim also include clothing. Clothing is kelim in biblical Hebrew. Clothing and also these large things that sit on the ground are also kelim. They're all kelim. Okay, I think we're going to stop here for tonight, though. Any last comments? Okay. Good. All right. I think I'll see you next week. There's this. I'm not leaving the country now, at least till August. There's a. I don't know if it's a lecture or present. There's like an interview with two archaeologists next Wednesday through the Times of Israel, and I'm thinking of going. But I'm going to decide the next day or two. If I go, then I'll ask you if we can switch the day for shear. But in principle, I don't want to switch the day for shear, so I haven't. But if any of you are interested in going, then tell me and I'll send you details. And by the way, the topic is a Bayit Rishon and Bayit Sheni. I think they have an expert for each one of them, and they're going to talk about comparing what archaeologists have found about Bayit Rishon and Bayit Sheni compared to the texts that we have that describe Beit Rishon and Beit Sheni. So-
Where does this take place?
It's, I don't remember where. It's here in Jerusalem, but I don't remember where they're
Um,
doing it. I can send you details.
מוזיאון המקרא אולי? I don't know.
I don't think
know.
so. אני לא זוכר.
Please send the details, because maybe there's a Zoom link.
I don't think it's going to be on Zoom, but what I think they're going to do, it's also a way for Times of Israel website to promote themselves. Anybody can come and get a ticket. If you're a paying subscriber, then you get a ticket for half price. But a full price ticket is 40 shekel. A half price ticket is 20 shekel. But also, if you're a full paying subscriber, you will have access to the video afterwards. So that's a reason why I might not go. Even I'm in a way, I'm kind of dying to go because I think I may have questions. But on the other hand, I really don't like to shift the time we do shir unless it's like absolutely necessary. But believe that, I'll send everybody later on. I'll send you a link and you can see the details. And that's it for tonight. Okay.
All right. Good night.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
תודה רבה.